wow, we didn't really see many people like us in STEM, in academia and in science communication. So we put our heads together and thought that a way to kind of feel more supported in this area was to create a network with its aim to be able to support, connect and showcase people across the UK who were in STEM fields from ethnic minority backgrounds. I think that in STEM and in research that we need to remember the equality and diversity practice within the research that we do. I think sometimes science is seen as a very objective field and it's kind of removed from perhaps some of these social inequalities that we might see. But I think sometimes that can also permeate into our research. And I think that it's really important to make sure that our practice in science and also in equality, diversity, in a social sense, is all inclusive.
Hi, and welcome to Digital Mentor Podcast. I'm Dr. Christine Boynette from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. This week, we have a bonus episode, and it will be structured slightly differently. The episode will be split into 5 different discussions where the team will interview different researchers about equity and diversity in research. So, over the past few months, the world has had to hold a mirror to itself and pay attention to the inequalities faced by many in different aspects of their lives. We decided to have this bonus episode to discuss various aspects of equity and diversity in research. This first interview, our producer Isabella Malta will be interviewing BBSTEM, which stands for Black British Individuals in Science, Technology, Engineering and Medicine, about representation and how it matters. Here's Isabella.
Okay, Sabrina, so tell me a bit about your background to start with and how you came to work with BBSTEM.
I am a scientist currently. I work in a small biotech here in Cambridge. And before that, I studied in France, actually. And I came to work with BBSTEM because I met Kaisha, the founder, at my previous job. We were both working at a very big company in Cambridge, a very big pharma company. And I met her. And yeah, it was the only other Black woman in the team. So I think maybe that created a bond. And I was just curious about her experience because she had been working at the company for quite a long time, I would say. And I asked about her experience there and we started talking. And then she told me that she founded BBSTEM and she told me about it. And it really resonated with my own values. And then I decided to join, but I actually joined not so long ago, probably 6 months ago or a bit more.
That's awesome. You're also normally based in Cambridge. I didn't realize you guys were in Cambridge as well. So tell me a bit about the work you do with BBSTEM.
So at BBSTEM, I am the Corporate Partnership Coordinator, which is a long title to say that I am at the interface with corporations. Sometimes they come to us with a need. Let's say they realize that they might not have that much of a diverse pool of employees, or they're looking to recruit, I'd say, people from other places in the UK and not just big universities, etc. So they might contact us and say, okay, how can we work on this? For me, I'm just helping to set up maybe events and insight days or help them to define criteria to recruit students for their jobs fair, etc.
Good. And do you usually just work with companies, or how is it the work of BBSTEM in general?
We focus on graduates. We're doing several things. For instance, recently we had some mental health workshops, and that was sponsored by the Academy of Medical Sciences. We are putting in place mentorship programs. We want to develop in the future an outreach program to go to schools, etc. So I'd say we have a very diverse pool of activities that we're trying to achieve, but I'm more focused on trying to come up with opportunities for our graduates.
Good. And how do you feel about the impact you've had so far? Do you think it's already measurable, or is it too early to say?
The work we're doing is very well received by the graduates and also, I'd say, maybe companies that we work with, because there's nothing like BBSTEM that exists yet. Because a lot of, I'd say, organizations, sometimes they might be on a broader scale and targeting minorities, like ethnic minorities as a big group and not just Black students or Black individuals. So yeah, for instance, the mental health workshop that we had recently were really well received. We had very good feedback from from the participants. It was so well received that we still had people on the waiting list, and we are about to hold another session that was not initially planned. So, and for one of the events, which was an Insight Day with AstraZeneca, it was very well received as well. The students were really happy to get to come to the site and then visit and have the opportunity to speak to scientists, etc. So I think although BBSTEM it's quite a new organization, we're getting there, and I think we're getting some recognition, and we're really happy of the feedback that.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about how representation matters. I was reading a paper by the National Bureau of Economics in the US, and the statistics are quite alarming that if a black kid has a black teacher by the end of the 3rd grade, the student is 13% more likely to go to college than a black student that doesn't have a black teacher. And if they have 2 black teachers, their chances increase to 32%. So it's really impressive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, of course, representation matters. And when I send the email in my signature, it's written STEM matters, representation matters, you matter. Well, to define representation, I'd say it's the way someone or something is described or shown. And I think the image of, if we're focusing on STEM, the image of a scientist is quite, you'd see Einstein. It's very male dominated, and it's very important to early on to show younger generation that a scientist can look like them. There's no boundaries at what a scientist can be you, can be someone else. And that will definitely inspire them, and that can really encourage them to pursue STEM studies and STEM careers. So yeah, representation is very important from a very young age to shape the image and the dreams that you might allow yourself to have.
It becomes a sort of a cycle, isn't it? Because if it's underrepresented, if you don't have anyone to look up to that looks like you think you're not going to be able to become a scientist or any other profession. But STEM subjects seems to see particularly underrepresented by other minorities. So you're trying to break the cycle a little bit and hopefully encourage young Black students to pursue STEM careers.
Yeah, when we think of representation, I think it's very important that we focus on, obviously, reaching to younger kids. What we're trying to do at BBSTEM is maybe more on the later stage, where people are already graduates and they are willing to set a foot in the professional world. But representation is really the tip of the iceberg. And I think if we want to tackle inequities in STEM, we need to have a really robust education system that really supports students from a younger age, students that have been inspired, by the representation, and that supports them throughout the journey until they get to the point where they're ready to set foot in the scientific fields and have a career. So yeah, education is very important. As much as representation is important, having a robust education system is, I think, crucial, really.
Are you planning on expanding a bit BBSTEM's work and eventually start working with school kids as well?
Yeah, I think this is something that we're willing to do and have an outreach program in place. I think people that had been there before me already had laid the foundation for this to happen. But obviously, we are a non-profit organization. So, at the moment, it's just us two, Kaisha and I, running BBSTEM, and we're both full-time scientists. So it's a lot. So we obviously need funding to hire more people so that we can put that in place. But yeah, that's definitely something we want to do. And we're receiving quite a bit of inquiries about people asking us if someone can come and speak to their schools. Do we know anyone that can reach out to younger people? There's a will at the moment to reach out to younger people, but we can't really do everything. But it's in the pipeline.
Yes, and hopefully if people that are listening to the podcast and are willing to get involved, they can get in touch as well. Maybe they can help you volunteer to spread the message.
Yeah, definitely. We're waiting for you.
And Sabrina, when did Kaisha start BBSTEM?
So I believe BBSTEM was funded in January 2018. So not so long ago, actually, 2 years and a half.
And you already have many, many followers. I've seen your Twitter account. The many people that I knew, that I studied with, follow your work.
Yeah, I think the biggest community that we have is on Twitter. A lot of people are following us. Yeah, it's really encouraging that the way people are engaging with us on every platform. So we're really excited to see where this would take us, really.
Great. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for agreeing to this short interview. And hopefully the impact is going to continue to grow. And can change the world. And STEM and representation, increased representation for sure.
Yeah, of course. And also just one last thing, as I was saying, that representation is really important, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. The British Science Association recently published a report about inequity in STEM education. So if anyone is really interested in digging deeper about these subjects, then they can check that report. It's very eye-opening.
Doing the research for this episode, we realized that the National Institutes of Health, as well as Wellcome, for instance, they admittedly are less likely to give up grants for Black students. And now hopefully that the discussion is hot at the moment. They all saying they're going to overcome this and the representation is going to increase. Also, journals like Cell and Nature admitted that they don't have any Black scientists in running the papers. So they also agreeing that they should change now. So I think what's happened with George Floyd in the US is really sad, but you open up discussion for a whole change in society, which is really welcome.
It's unfortunate that it took this tragic event for things to start moving, as in really moving, because people have been talking about this subject for years and even decades. I think it's great that things are starting to be put in place and people start to realize where there are gaps and working towards change, really. I'm really hoping that we can get past the stage where we only have think tanks and talks and presentation and reports and then really implement things, get funding and get programs in place to actually change things.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons we decided to do this bonus episode. It wasn't planned to start with, but we decided that maybe if you can also just talk a little bit about it, we can help a tiny bit and just bringing awareness of the whole problem to people.
This next part, I'll be interviewing Dr. Iruka Okeke about equity in research and her experience being a researcher in Nigeria whilst being on a global stage. Hi, I'm Christine. Continuing on the equity and diversity theme, we thought it was important to talk about equity in research, how some of these challenges may not be as obvious to researchers in high-income countries, for example, getting reagents shipped, to recruiting and maintaining highly trained staff. How then do researchers in the Global South stay in the quote-unquote game, but also shine and be the diversity we need and want to see? With me today to talk about some of these challenges and successes of setting up her lab in Nigeria is Professor Iruka Okeke. She, in my personal view, and I'm sure my peers would agree, is a key player in the bacterial genomics surveillance field and more broadly, global health research. Welcome, Iruka, and thank you so much for making the time to come to chat to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. To kick us off, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and the research that you're involved in?
As you said in the introduction, I'm a bacterial geneticist. I was trained in Nigeria. I had my first and postgraduate degrees in Nigeria and then did postdoctoral research at the University of Maryland. Our lab studies diarrheal pathogens. We're interested in the molecular epidemiology as well as how they colonize in the intestines of the hosts. And then we also study antimicrobial resistance. We use bacterial genetic and genomic methods to do this. And then we have recently started doing some drug discovery to find alternatives to antibiotics.
Thank you so much. And, in your intro, you said antimicrobial resistance, which, as you know, is, everyone knows this. It's such a big field and involves pretty much the whole world. How have you found working in Nigeria, but also collaborating with, obviously, the globe and people in different parts of the world? Do you find that ease of conversation has been sort of fruitful in you setting up your lab in Nigeria?
Yeah, maybe from the inside, antimicrobial resistance doesn't feel that big. It's certainly a lot bigger than it was several years ago. It's grown a lot, but there's a lot less interest and activity in the field than is necessary. So yes, there is a global discourse that's actually helpful. A lot is being done to understand resistance better. There's interest in having this done everywhere because resistance is a global problem, but more of it is being done in some parts of the world than others. And so that makes it really actually very important for people who are working in parts of the world where this is studied less. It makes them more relevant, if you like, to the global discourse because we need information from understudied areas.
Even studying antimicrobial resistance, one of the tools you use is genomic sequencing. Can you give us a bit more of information about how you managed to set up your genomic surveillance lab in Nigeria? And what are the biggest challenges or some of the biggest challenges you found in setting up your lab in Nigeria to do genomic surveillance?
Yeah, so firstly, genomics is actually a relatively new entrant into the antimicrobial resistance surveillance field. It's been used a lot more for viral diseases than it has for bacterial diseases until relatively recently, because now it's cheaper. And it being cheaper is one of the reasons now why we can use it cost effectively in places like Nigeria, where there isn't that much resource for research. When we, and we being me and my collaborators, I'm part of a 5-country global health research unit. When we decided that we wanted to do this in our countries, some of the things that we were concerned about was where we're going to be able to get enough bioinformatic expertise. That's key to be able to understand the data, where we're going to be able to set up the instrumentation, where we're going to be able to procure consumables, and where we're going to be able to make all this work. And it turns out that some of those fears were well-grounded, and others were actually relatively easy to circumvent. The bioinformatic expertise, for example, was one issue that I was very concerned about, because there isn't that much bioinformatic expertise within Nigeria. But it turns out that if you have smart people and you give them the opportunity and the resources to learn, they can actually learn very quickly. So I've actually been delighted with the progress we've made with bioinformatics. We have 2 lead bioinformaticians who are really, really highly skilled, and most of the members of my team involved in any kind of genomics work have basic bioinformatics skills so that they can ask and answer questions. So that's been really successful. In terms of procurement, that has been very, very, very challenging. It's challenging, obviously, because we're buying some things that are expensive, but it's also challenging because our systems aren't set up for making high-value purchases and for bringing in things from outside the country. There are no sequencers, for example, that are made in Nigeria, and so they have to be imported. So there's been a lot of difficulty with the very first and basic thing is just getting money transferred. This is actually a challenge in many African countries, some more than others. In Nigeria, a few years ago, the laws got changed so that all money is transferred centrally. And this made it very hard for us to transfer money quickly, because now everything has to go through the central bank. In terms of procuring things from the outside, there are very few companies that make sequencers. They are monopolies, and they know this. And Africa is not one of their most fruitful markets. So we tend to pay more for what I consider less service. And this has been an ongoing challenge. It's taken us 3 times as long as the other sites to be able to set up sequencing locally, and we are paying more. So that has been harder, and I won't say that we've completely overcome it, because it's something that we're still battling at this point.
That's such a bizarre and really sad note to hear, that you pay more for less service despite being from, a low and middle income country. How are you trying to overcome that? Can you incorporate that into your grant writing and kind of circumvent that by including that in when you write a fellowship? Or how would you kind of overcome this challenge?
Yes, we're very fortunate that for us, all our genomic work is actually funded by grants. Before you submit a grant, you go and find out how much things are going to cost. And your budget is really based on the pricing that you got. So that means that we can afford to buy these things because the funders have been very generous. The funders understand the landscape. They too are concerned about it. So, for us, this hasn't stopped us getting the technologies that we want. It's only created delays and obviously more experts. The other route, I think, towards bringing these prices down and improving service, it's a long-term thing, is that more of us have to be doing this. My thought is that when there's a critical mass of people who need sequencing service, then the prices will come down. This is happening in places like India. And so really we have to enable others to get these grants so that they can buy more machines, and then it will be more economical for the companies to have a Nigeria office. Right now we have an Africa office that is in the Middle East, and that's not very helpful if you need quick and efficient service, no matter how well or how committed they are.
I can assume even for the yearly servicing that you may require or call out service, they have to come specifically to your country out from the Middle East. That must incur a fairly hefty cost for servicing and upkeep of the machine, right?
Yeah, and so they fold that in, and this is why our service contracts are more expensive. And just to give you a very practical example, we had a sequencer that we actually expected to get over a year ago. It was only just delivered in February. And when it was delivered, the very first thing we needed to do, obviously, was to get it installed. And the installation engineer is coming from abroad. And so we have to work for him to get a visa. That takes a few weeks. And by the time he got his visa, his outbound and our inbound were all closed due to COVID.
Oh, no.
So we have a sequencer sitting in a crate, which should have been sequencing for several months. Whereas if this had been an in-country thing, if we had a Nigeria engineer for that company, with the outside borders closed, he would have been able to set up the machine very easily. So these are just some of the examples of things that we have to deal with.
And how quickly can you get reagents? I remember my time working in Vietnam, sometimes getting reagents was a bit of a mission, and these reagents have a shelf life. Even things like antibiotics, when you're looking at antibiotic resistance, how then do you get reagents in sufficient time for them not to expire? Have you ever come across that particular challenge, or that's not really a challenge as much?
Yeah, it's a large challenge for us, not just in sequencing, but everything we do in the lab. Very few of the things we use are actually made in Nigeria. So we have to procure all of them from outside. And certainly compared to some other African countries I've visited, there are fewer in-country distributors in Nigeria. So again, we're working with fewer people who are finding it harder to operate since money transfer and other things have been made a bit more stringent in Nigeria. So from the time we make an order to the time we receive the goods, it really depends on the supplier we're dealing with, but it could be weeks or even months. And then also, when you don't have a local distributor, you often can't choose to have things that have a very long shelf life on them. So you've really just got to do a lot of advanced planning. You design your experiments very, very carefully because you can't order one thing and then order again if it goes wrong. You make sure that when the materials are delivered that you're ready to go as soon as possible so that things don't sit around in fridges and expire, as you said. So yes, it is more challenging. It does involve more advanced planning. To be able to work under these circumstances.
And there's no some sort of fast tracking with the government or anything, knowing that this is for, the good of the country and in fact the world. There's no form of fast track for labs, is there?
Not in Nigeria. So I've spoken to colleagues in other African countries. A colleague in Mali said absolutely that when something's at the port, if it's for research purposes, it gets delivered before the paperwork is done.
Wow.
Things like that would really help us out. But we don't have those systems in place. We've started the process of asking for them, but I think it would take some time to get them. For some consumables, we're fortunate to have in-country suppliers that actually have warehousing. So in that case, we can actually order and get things delivered very quickly. But for most of the highly specialist consumables, that just isn't available.
So that's actually one piece of advice you'd say. First, look for suppliers that would have in-country warehouses to help sort of overcome that minor challenge of getting stuff on time and in date, right?
Yeah, I suppose in some countries that would be some advice, but in our case, we often don't have a choice. There's one supplier. So if he has in-country warehousing, fantastic. If he doesn't, that's too bad. But then the other thing to pay attention to is that sometimes we have the option of not using an in-country supplier, perhaps having it directly imported from outside. And sometimes that's very tempting. However, when you do this, you sort of undercut the in-country supplier so that they become less efficient, they have less capital, and then they can't offer in-country warehousing. So where there is an in-country supplier, we try and go with the in-country supplier, provided their pricing is reasonable.
And even that comes back to the wonderful word that you said, that critical mass. And I guess some of this also relies on lobbying other people and kind of lobbying people to understand the need for genomic surveillance. Have you had to do that not only in Nigeria, but also within the African continent or global south in general? How have you found that type of lobbying to convince people to do this so that they can convince governments to do this and kind of make this process a little bit easier for people in the global south? Have you had any experience of lobbying for that critical mass?
A little bit. So the interesting thing about genomic surveillance is that, particularly in the field of antimicrobial resistance, it's new everywhere. So even Public Health England only recently moved from using other methods to using genomic surveillance with its salmonella. So it's really a new story everywhere. And so those of us who are doing this are constantly telling the story all over the world, not just in parts of Africa. I think many of the funders now agree with this. Many of the public health institutes agree with this, but there's still a lot of work that has to be done on that level. Then on the level of, sort of what happens in Africa, we're going to have to pilot this using grants, such as we are doing now, to show that it's value for money before governments take it on. And so what that means is that African scientists are going to have to want to apply for these grants and succeed in getting them. So some of the so-called lobbying actually is really working with people to develop proposals that would be competitive enough for them to get the funding. Because even though sequencing costs are coming down tremendously, sequencing is still costly. And so it's the sort of thing that you can't do with a small grant. You're going to either have to get a big grant or partner with somebody who has a big grant. And so really you need very, very good grantmanship skills to be able to enter the field.
And I've seen that you're part of the African Academy of Sciences. Do you think being in such big organizations has really been fruitful in you making collaborations for, in the continent and then, thereafter collaborations in high income countries? Have you found that has been a useful way? Because we had Grace Mora on board and, we were talking about African Academy of Sciences. How have you found that incorporating into grant writing and this kind of bigger picture and lobbying as such?
Yeah, this is a really nice time to be doing, cutting edge science in Africa because the Academy is really in a nice position right now. I'm very new to the Academy. I became a fellow just a little over a year ago. I'm also funded by AISA, which is the Academy's funding arm. And also that has been very nice to see. So the fact that we have, for example, granting programs within the continent that are able to give large grants, large enough to set up sequencing projects and so on, and vested in the things that are really important to our continent. I think that's really, really important. And it's really nice that in addition to spotlighting fellows who are, scientists who have done excellent work on the continent and having a grant program that can offer grants, they're also building grantmanship skills. So they offer workshops for aspiring grant writers. They also offer support and training for institutions to manage grants. So this has been really, really nice coming from the Academy, and I'm really glad that they're taking leadership in that way.
That's awesome to hear. And I mean, seeing something so big come into fruition and working not only for sort of in the mentorship aspect, but also in actual getting grants in. I think that's a really awesome thing to hear. As you say, genomic surveillance is fairly new. And for a while, I mean, I came into this quite a few years ago now, but, back then getting the machine was fairly easy, but getting the expertise, and you touched about this briefly, about getting enough skilled bioinformaticians to be able to analyze the data, especially now with the access to online resources, and even now having virtualized conferences. Do you see this as a positive way forward to increase resources, thereby increasing expertise and hopefully subsequently more lobbyists or more people to kind of collaborate within the continent? How have you found this virtualization and online courses being of help in the Global South?
Yes, I think we're on the cusp of a bioinformatics explosion for a number of reasons. I think the first generation, people like you, have got the skills and they're really eager to pass them on. Bioinformatics is different from many of the other things I do, like wet lab, molecular biology, or even just basic microbiology, because once you've got your computing infrastructure, you can go.
Yeah.
You're not waiting for consumables that expire. You need the computer. You need internet access, which we do not take for granted in Nigeria. It's actually very, very expensive, but you can procure it, obviously. So once you have those things in place and you're willing to teach yourself, you can learn. And the nice thing is that there are people who have got these skills that are actually willing to mentor other people. I mentioned that we have 2 lead bioinformaticians who we trained almost from scratch, with a lot of help from colleagues at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute. And the number of people they have trained is unbelievable. And of course, these other people are going to train other people. And then also within the continent, there's the H3 BioNet initiative that is building bioinformatics expertise. There are many colleagues like me that are doing the same thing. So even if only a fraction of these people stay in science, they will train other people. The other nice thing about bioinformatics is that much of the resources, in terms of software as well as sequences that you want to analyze, they're in the public domain. And so if you know how to collect and use these things, you can actually use them at very little cost.
You've touched on something that's super important to me, and also my senior producer, Alice Matimba and Isabella Malta. They work in the advanced courses and scientific conferences, and much of that is getting training to overseas units, but also starting to train the trainer. And as you say, it's one of those things, once you get into bioinformatics, you end up automatically training people. It just seems to be a paid forward type of culture. And we say here, the podcast as well, paying it forward in mentorship, but also in training. How have you seen kind of this bridge with, and I'm hoping, with the training closes the gap a bit more. How have collaborations with the high income countries assisted in any way or helped, or do you see that as having allies in the global north has assisted in getting your lab or getting anyone's lab in the global south as part of? Do you think we're ready to do it completely by ourselves, or sometimes it's always good to have allies?
Well, it's always good to have allies, and I think even in the highest income settings, people appreciate collaborators. The most important thing collaborators bring to the table is expertise, and once you've had different experiences from someone else, you will see things differently. And so I think collaborations will always be mutually beneficial. I think that is if they are true collaborations. So certainly having people to test ideas of, sometimes I have a wacky idea and it's good to sort of share that idea with someone who has a completely different background, and then they'll be able to say, why didn't you do it this way or that way, that kind of thing. There's also, you've implemented your wacky idea. How can I make it better? Being able to talk to somebody else, be that somebody on the African continent or elsewhere, again, is very valuable. And then I guess the third thing is resources. We actually have, very often these things are set up as, the resource rich and the resource poor setting. But where genomics is concerned, it's a bit more balanced, because certainly when you're on the analysis side, we tend to have more novel and unique genomes. So that's a resource that would be really useful to other people. And then again, a lot of the funding that is being used to set up genomic surveillance in Africa, I spoke about AES as an example, but they are the exception. Most of the funding is coming from outside of Africa. And very often, particularly if it's government funding, governments want to be able to tell their taxpayers that their citizens are also involved in the research. And so partnering with people who work in countries that are willing to support this kind of thing in Africa actually does leverage the types of resources that you can reach out for.
I really like your view on that and how you put it, because even working in bacterial genomics, I worked with typhi for a bit, and there's really excellent work when you look at the genomics of typhi, where what happens, in Eastern Africa through Southeast Asia and South Asia, and then it's very different on the kind of Western Africa side, because there's almost two different types of evolution, and without information from everywhere, we wouldn't have been able to see how typhi behaves. And so the science is one thing, the samples are another, but the actual talking between people to understand something, I find is really important. And I like how you said that, once we've got the resources, which is just your computer and your internet, you can go. I really think that's the way forward in terms of how we go from here. And was there anything else you'd like to add on top of that, saying how we move forward in terms of getting the global south and bridging that gap, surveillance, as we said, genomics, and also the lab side. We've not even touched on the lab. Maybe we should touch a bit on the lab. With global surveillance with AMR, there's a lot of lab work involved. How have you found doing the lab side of it?
So two things. Before I talk about the lab, I did want to say one more thing about collaboration, and that's to encourage those who are in the global south, who are in African countries, to remember that they actually do bring a lot of strength and intellectual heft to collaborations, and to think about that when they are looking for collaborators. Because if you're just looking for someone to, pay for your research, then you're really looking for a donor or a funder. But if you're looking for a collaborator, you should think about, what you will bring intellectually and what the collaborator will bring intellectually as well, to keep that balance. Because we find that the balanced collaborations are actually the most creative ones. And then your question about lab work. So yes, I'm a lab scientist through and through. The bioinformatics and the genomics has just really made us be able to answer questions more efficiently. But, we have a really bubbling lab here. Most people, with the exception of my bioinformaticians, they hold test tubes in the lab too. I have no idea what they're doing with them. But yeah, so most people in my group, they do some work in the lab. And it's fun. The things we study are important for global health. They're important for dealing with disease, for understanding disease. But I do tell people, and they're always surprised when I say this, that I went into science because this is fun. I really like E. coli. I like seeing colonies on plates. And it's nice that while enjoying myself doing that, I can also do something that's worthwhile. Yeah, so it's really nice to have the opportunity to introduce many more people to science. We find certainly 1 or 2 generations back, when I was a student, we got a lot more lab practical experience than your average student in Nigeria gets now, just because the resources to do that are fewer per student. And so being able to supervise somebody's undergraduate project where they can do independent research on their own or start somebody off on a master's degree, that is just so much fun and, makes doing the lab work, continuing to do the lab work worthwhile. So the challenges associated with that. We've talked about procurement and those challenges. We also have equipment servicing challenges. There's not a lot of bioengineering in the country. If you're using outside suppliers, then they don't have in-country service. So getting things fixed and repaired is a bit of a challenge. The more that you can do yourself, the better. We are not very good at that in my group, but I know there are other groups where they can do a lot of their basic servicing themselves.
Wow.
And that actually can really help to move the servicing and keeping the maintenance along. And then we talked about the fact that, consumables expire. And so if you don't have very robust supply chains, it's actually difficult to keep things in date. I do a lot of teaching, classroom teaching as well as research teaching. And so we can, sometimes if something's about to expire and we have a class that can use it up, that is sometimes one way to deal with this. But it is an ongoing problem because these things are actually very expensive and we can't just afford to dispose them, so we have to do a lot of planning around that. And then I should say, when I was moving back to Nigeria, so for many years I actually taught in the US. When I was moving back to Nigeria, a lot of people asked me, well, you're in an institution, I was in an American institution that got very bright students. They said, aren't you concerned that you may not get students that are that good or that motivated? But that has never been an issue. University of Ibadan, the students, they are bright enough to go and do anything in the world. They are probably more motivated. And so, the human resource that we've had here has just been tremendous.
I've always said, giving somebody access is kind of the main thing. I mean, I'm a product of getting scholarships and getting to this country. So I think it's a matter of just getting access. Once you get there and you do your work, I'm sure you see some really, really bright students coming through your doors and they can be competitive anywhere. So it's just getting that equity to get to wherever they're going so that we can see diversity in different places in the world. And as you just said, we have that type of skill in the global south and they shouldn't be overlooked. Was there any other thing you'd want to add, as we're coming to the end of our interview? I mean, this has been such an interesting conversation, but I just wanted to throw it back to you if there's anything we've missed in the conversation.
I guess I would say that the one place where I find I'm spending a lot more time developing skills in my students is writing. I should remind you that Nigeria, the lingua franca is actually English, so it's not, a language thing. They've done primary, secondary school, university, all in English. I think we as teachers just haven't put enough emphasis on the importance of writing. And I really encourage the young scientists. The writing it's like bioinformatics, the sort of thing that if you're motivated, you can do a lot of teaching yourself. I would encourage people to do that because we are mistaught sometimes. I certainly was mistaught when I was in high school.
Me too.
If you like writing, you do the arts. And if you can't write, you can do the sciences. And I know a lot of scientists who can't write, but all the leaders in the field I know, they're really good writers. So if you want to be a scientific leader, I think developing your writing is a really important thing to do.
How would you give advice to somebody? Is it a skill they can, like a muscle they can work at? What was the one piece of advice in getting good at writing that you'd give to somebody wanting to improve their writing?
I like the analogy of a muscle. First of all, read. The more you read, the more likely you're going to see words and get used to what good writing looks like and have something to aspire to. That being said, read but don't copy. The second thing is write. Write several drafts of things, share them not just with your supervisor, but even with your colleagues. If you're developing an idea, write it down, send it. We'll still have a discussion about it. But if you write it down, I can give you feedback on what you wrote. So I think reading and writing are really, really important, and not just doing it when it's formally required, but actually looking for opportunities to read and write. And like you said, it's muscle that you can build. Some people are natural writers. And the vast majority of us, myself included, are people who just kept lifting weights until the muscles got stronger.
I like that. And I was going to add to your point also, you can write with Word, Microsoft Word, when you have suggested edits. I always try and read, and this is how I've learned from writing as well. So when, let's say, my PI writes and gives me suggestions, I actually read it, because sometimes you can quite easily just accept all changes and you never bother reading. So I always say, look at the red and see how they've phrased something, because it somehow can change the meaning of a sentence. I find writing really interesting. And those are some really, really good points. And I'm sure our listeners have taken down diligent notes, but hopefully we'll have them in our description box. But Iruka, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And I can now stop stalking you at conferences and actually come and talk to you now.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun. And actually, I go to conferences to talk to people. So I'd love to hear from everybody.
I will definitely be coming to say hello to you over coffee for sure. Thanks again, Iruka.
Thank you.
More when we return. This is your Digital Mentor Podcast.
This episode is supported by Advanced Courses and Scientific Conferences, a program which develops and delivers training and conferences that span basic research, cutting-edge biomedicine, and application of genomics in healthcare. Through engaging and networking, the events educate, inspire, and transform careers worldwide.
This episode is also supported by the Wellcome Sanger Institute. It undertakes large-scale research that forms the foundations of knowledge in biology and medicine. It uses the power of genome sequencing to understand and harness the information in DNA. The Sanger's discoveries are used to improve health and to understand life on Earth.
This episode is also supported by social entrepreneurship to spur health. The SESH group uses crowdsourcing to enhance health and health research with a focus on low and middle income countries.
Welcome back. This next part, our senior producer, Dr. Alice Matimba, will be interviewing Dr. Eva Maria Cutiongco-de La Paz from the Philippines. And she'll be talking to us about her experiences of equity in research and putting genomics in the Philippines on the map.
I'm Dr. Alice Matimba, based at Advanced Courses and Scientific Conferences at the Wellcome Genome Campus, and I am your host today. In this segment, we'll be discussing issues around equality, diversity, and inclusion, with a special focus on bridging the gap for health and research. There are several ongoing discussions and debates about inequalities, underrepresentation, and disparities in global health and research. And today we'll be talking about what we should be doing to bridge that gap. I would like to welcome one of the most driven and passionate women in addressing health disparities through her academic, research, and community work, Dr. Eva Maria Cutiongco-de La Paz. So before we dig deep into our discussions, would you like to tell us more about yourself, your work and research interests, Eva?
Thanks, Alice. I'm Eva. I'm actually the Executive Director of the National Institutes of Health, University of the Philippines, Manila. This is the institutional home of a network of researchers within our university. But on a national scale, the NIH Philippines is a major resource center for health research and capacity building for the country. Under me, actually, are 10 institutes and 4 centers, as well as 19 active study groups. Alice, I also concurrently serve as the Health Program Director of the Philippine Genome Center, and likewise head the Division of Genetics of the Philippine General Hospital. So I'm wearing a number of hats right now.
Yeah, wow. So it's quite a rich portfolio you have. I want to start by quoting you on one of your promotional videos where you mentioned that Philippines should not be left behind. And so my question is, do you feel that Philippines is lagging too much behind in terms of application of technologies, particularly focused in healthcare and research? You are working a lot in genomics. What's your feeling about that?
I started my research career in the last probably 20 years ago. And I think I've seen that the Philippines has improved a lot in terms of the research landscape. In particular for health research, we've been fortunate enough to see that in the last 10 years or so, there's now a better infrastructure to do research in my particular field, genomics. Government has invested in equipment that will allow us to do genomics research. In terms of institutional capacity, there has also been a lot of support that the government has given for us to be able to do cutting-edge research in the country.
That's quite good that the government is supporting research. But of course, in addition to, government providing, say, funding for infrastructure and other resources, it's quite clear that there's a big gap in terms of, researchers coming from low and middle income countries in different parts of the world and also in Southeast Asia. How can researchers feel more empowered to contribute more to global health solutions?
I think there are two things that a country should be prepared for, because these are the challenges that we face in terms of health research. One is that we should be able to improve the ability of our researchers to perhaps effectively and efficiently define problems, set objectives and priorities for the country, to be able to do research that's relevant to the needs of our country. The second one is really building institutions and organizations that can respond again to the research needs of our country. I would say that the country has addressed these challenges in the past years. The first one I mentioned about, defining the problems, setting objectives and priorities, right? We now have a national unified health research agenda for the country. I was fortunate enough to be part of the last setting of we call it the NURA, the National Unified Health Research Agenda. It ensures that health research is responsive to the health system's need and that investments of the government to fund researchers. This NURA is actually a product of multiple stakeholders who come together to do consultations to set the priority agenda. This was made possible because the government, through the Department of Science and Technology, as well as the Department of Health, these big government agencies initiated the creation of a coordinated system for health research. It's called PNHRS, which stands for the Philippine National Health Research System. This aims to promote cooperation and integration of all health research efforts and stakeholders in the country to ensure that research contributes to evidence-informed health policies and action. Now, there are 4 implementing agencies of the Philippine National Health Research System. Fortunately, the UP National Institutes of Health is one of those 4 agencies, together with the Department of Health, the Department of Science and Technology, and the Commission on Higher Education. So the setting of the NURA was really instrumental for the funding agencies of the government to be able to fund the one that needs the research projects that actually address the most important health issues of the country. Again, this agenda takes into account Sustainable Development Goals, the Philippine Development Plan, and other national health plans, which are anchored on every presidential term. In fact, this NURA that we have for 2017 to 2022 is already the 3rd NURA that we have in the country. So it started way back in 1999.
Okay, so and I'm assuming that you have trained a lot of researchers over this time and benefited a lot from this program.
I would like to think that we are really exerting all efforts to be able to build capacities of researchers as well as institutions to do research. I must say that for this present National Unified Health Research Agenda, the consultations took us almost a year to develop. But at the end, we came up with a very good research themes for the research agenda, which includes first is responsive health systems, research to enhance and extend healthy lives, holistic approaches to health and wellness, health resiliency. It also includes global competitiveness and innovation in health, and research in equity and health. It's a broad enough agenda that it should be inclusive enough to be able to include as many researchers from different disciplines, including the social sciences, not only medical, but also the social sciences.
Wow, it sounds like a very extensive program. Obviously, working not only with just government departments, but also research institutes and so forth. I just want to bring you back to the work you're doing at the Genome Center. So you've mentioned that you're set up the Genome Center. Would like to hear more about how this is contributing to, to this big agenda of providing more resources for research and bridging the gap.
I serve as a part of the organization now as the health program director. But really, this was built by 4 professors from the university, which happened after we hosted the Human Genome Organization in the Asia Pacific way back in 2013. The president then of our university was invited to sit with several key people who were our guests for that Human Genome meeting, which happened not in Manila, but in one of the big islands of the country, Cebu. And during that meeting, our president, then President Roman, appreciated the fact that there were so many countries in attendance and that there was so much genomics work happening in different parts of the world. And she asked, is there a similar genome center in the Philippines where all the research work from different countries were coming from? We mentioned at that time that there was none. And so there were 4 people from the university who were instrumental then to set up the Genome Center, and that's our chancellor, Dr. Carmencita Padilla. We also have our vice president for academic affairs then, Professor Giselle Concepcion. Third is another professor from molecular biology, and that's the current executive director, Dr. Cynthia Saloma. And the 4th is actually from the Department of Science and Technology, who was one of the advocates of building this Genome Center, and that's former Undersecretary Ami Guevara. So these 4 women traveled in different parts of Asia and even in the United States to look at how genome centers are set up. And so when they came home, there was a plan that came out. The university had to provide the building, but most of the equipment really came from government agencies like the Department of Science and Technology, as well as the Commission on Higher Education. So that's actually where I came in. I was the project leader of a Commission on Higher Education Philippine California Advanced Research Institute grant to build a next generation sequencing facility. With this huge grant, we were able to procure all the next generation sequencers. This equipment will allow us now to move forward our research projects related to agriculture, because there is a health program for agriculture. There is a program for diversity and population genetics. There's also a program for, of course, for health. And then we have core facilities for bioinformatics, as well as, of course, the DNA sequencing facility. With that, we're using those different areas to use genomics in nation building.
Wow, that's really great work. Obviously, setting these kinds of facilities comes with challenges. What are some of those challenges that you face and your team and others have faced in putting this together?
I came across an article written by Charles Rotimi and his team, and it was in Public Health Genomics. And I'd like to echo what they said there, right? For why low middle income countries actually have participated minimally in genomics research. There is a lack of coherent national policies for genomics because it's really something like a new discipline. Mm-hmm. Second is the limited number of well-trained genomic scientists. And I can say that is true for our country as well. Third is a poor research infrastructure as far as having sequencers or next-gen sequencers are concerned. And fourth, just really the local economics and cultural challenges. Although we probably have most of this, the fact that now we have the research infrastructure. Second is we're trying our best to build a pool of scientists who are working on genomics. I think we are getting somewhere.
We've obviously been working with you to train people, and this is something that is very important to us as well, in terms of your own experiences as you have been, developing your career as a researcher, as a health practitioner and all that. What has it been like for you to do all that you do? You wear many hats. And what has it been like for you to get to this stage?
I got my training not in the Philippines for genetics. After doing my pediatric residency, I went to Japan to do a molecular genetics fellowship in Kobe at the Kobe University International Center for Medical Research. And after that, I went to Canada, the University of Toronto, to get my clinical genetics fellowship training at the Hospital for Sick Children. And when I came back, I had a big task coming back, and that was to set up the molecular genetics unit at the Institute of Human Genetics. Before I left, we only had a cytogenetics unit and a newborn screening laboratory at the National Institutes of Health. When I came back, one of my goals was to be able to start that molecular laboratory going to answer the needs of our patients who needed tests for confirmation of diagnosis, but also to be able to, more importantly, do research on our own population. So that was quite a challenge because I didn't even know, upon coming back, who are the clinicians I can work with. At that time, there were only 2 geneticists in the country for 75 million Filipinos when I got back in 1999. But now I'm pleased to tell you that now we have about 14 clinical geneticists serving 109 million Filipinos.
But I mean, you've been able to go abroad, get trained. And I think what's inspiring is that you came back and you have been trying to give back to your community and build on what you had been, what you learned abroad and obviously locally as well. So that's quite something that I think a lot of researchers have to do, right? To go abroad and then come back and help to build the capacity locally.
And now we are working on our younger generation. But because if we're able to build the infrastructure here, those who have left to take their PhDs abroad know that when they come back, there's a home. They can go to a research lab. They can work on whatever they learned in different centers abroad. Because many of the clinicians now get exposed to the international scene because they attend conferences and they see the importance of genomics and molecular genetics in their line of specialty. I found out actually, Alice, that I have a number of colleagues in the university who would like to do work on genomics. And that's why I must say that with friendship plus research, started meaningful collaboration. So I have been working with cardiologists and we have a cardiovascular genetics study group. I've been working with endocrinologists, those who specialize on diabetes. We have research projects with them in the lines of looking for biomarkers for disease risk, as well as pharmacogenetics. And third, actually one of the more successful collaborations I've had, although I am not the lead, is a collaboration with otorhinolaryngologists. And this is for looking at susceptibility markers for a common disease of the ear, infection of the ear called otitis media. With those collaboration with the otorhinolaryngologists, we have now been able to discover 3 disease variants for susceptibility to otitis media in an indigenous community of the Philippines.
That's really amazing. And, sometimes people talk about genomics research being a unifier of, a research unifier where I think everybody is interested in contributing to, all these discoveries. Do you feel that, you're doing your part in, contributing to this very important field globally?
I would say for our country, I would like to recognize the fact that it really takes a village to use genomics for nation building. It will take a village. And I'm quite pleased to know that I have colleagues out there who also from the basic sciences and the clinics who would like to go on this journey with me, building genomic medicine for our country.
You've obviously are shining a very bright light to, you know, the future of research, of genomics, of healthcare in Philippines, I guess in Asia as well. What are some of the key things you'd like to share with sort of like the early and upcoming researchers in Asia? What would you like to share that could help to motivate them to, you know, to feel inspired to take up research careers?
I think one of the more important things that I'd like to share, especially for the young people who are in developing countries like the Philippines and other developing countries around Asia and in the world, is that we really have to take up that role in knowledge discovery for public good. We cannot also work in silos. We really have to start moving out of our areas of comfort to be able to reach out to other disciplines of science to make sure that whatever work that we're doing, let's say for me, for genomic medicine, I also have to work with social scientists. What is going to be the acceptability of such a new discipline of medicine to other people, and how do we actually integrate this to the health system when in fact most of the people know about medicine in a traditional manner? And then of course not to close our doors to new ideas that are coming in, but always to proceed with caution. Always try to find the best evidence for what sort of steps, new things that we'd like to be able to introduce in the health system that will be supported by evidence coming from research. For me, one of the more important things that we need to realize is that we cannot just adapt what things that other more developed countries do in terms of healthcare, because our resources are just too limited. So we need to be able to adapt and make the most of what we have and make the necessary adjustments. At the same time, we cannot be left behind and just stay, where we're at, like just maintain the status quo. Because for sure, countries like ours, developing countries, have most to gain from genomic technologies that are happening, because we cannot waste precious resources from ineffective therapies. And I think that's where genomic medicine comes in, because we can do precision medicine for our people.
Wow, that's really, really powerful. We're just reaching the end of our segment, and I just want to hear from you what key messages that you would like our audience to hear.
Two aspects I'd like to share would really be that each country should have a clear national health research priority. Should be clear about what their national health research priorities are. And I think the exercise of having that priority setting for our National Unified Health Research Agenda will really be instrumental in moving our health research forward and making sure that the needs of our health system will be addressed accordingly. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, although we see a lot of research data coming from different countries that are being used to provide evidence to make healthcare better, we should really start focusing on what we can do, where we can innovate to make sure what we can discover, so that these discoveries can be translated into innovations that may be more relevant to our country than in other parts of the globe. I'm saying this because at the National Institutes of Health, we're already making diagnostic kits that are useful for our population, like even for this present pandemic. One of our research scientists was able to develop a COVID-19 RT-PCR test. There are people who are also developing kits for dengue and other diseases that plague our country. This is very important, the innovation part. And the reason for that is we cannot be dependent on other countries to get diagnostic kits forever. I think we need to be able to stand up on our own, be self-reliant in terms of diagnostics, and hopefully in the future, even for therapeutics.
That's really a powerful message to all the important stakeholders, the policymakers, and all the leaders. And I think that's really quite important to encourage innovation locally and to make sure that communities can stand alone when it comes to health matters.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me. I'm still overwhelmed with gratefulness for how you and your team took the time out last November to come to the Philippines to help us with the Welcome Genome Campus Bioinformatics Workshop.
Thank you.
I think the kids who work with you from the Philippine Genome Center, our research assistants and research associates, are using already what they learned from that course to move forward our way to analyze data, big data, from the sequencing that we are able to do now. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a very kind testimonial.
In the fourth interview in the series, Alice, whom you just heard from, will be interviewing Dr. Collet Dandara to talk about his experience in bridging the gap and championing access to higher education for everyone. Here's Alice.
In this segment of our Equality and Diversity episode, we'll be discussing just some of the challenges and opportunities for addressing equality and diversity issues and how we can help empower African scientists and researchers to be confident, to become more visible and acknowledged and leading on the world stage, particularly in global health research, where we know there are still some significant disparities, and how can we bridge that gap. Joining me is Professor Collet Dandara from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Welcome, Collet.
Thank you.
So would you like to tell us more about yourself, your research, what you do?
Yes, I am a human genetics researcher. My focus is on pharmacogenomics, but I'm particularly interested in capacity development, especially of African researchers, because there is very few in our geographical area. And also even those that are there who might not be African, there is an aging cohort of both the researchers and academics. So that is the area that I'm really fascinated in trying to contribute and grow.
So in fact, I worked with Collet briefly during my PhD studies at the UCT, and I'm proud to see how he has risen up in the ranks. Now a celebrated academic and research leader in genomics. Congratulations. So it's inspiring to see how much dedication and passion and commitment can get you places. And today we want to learn more about, that journey that you've taken, and also talk about some of the challenges that you've faced. And, in the end, also give some pointers as to what we can do to continue building that, you're interested in building capacity and seeing more researchers from Africa making it. We know that people who come from certain backgrounds or who are underprivileged often struggle to make it in their careers. How do you think, issues such as inequality, particularly in research, how do you think that affects careers and performance?
If you look particularly in the face of South Africa, you will see that we are still grappling with the effects of colonialism, and particularly apartheid that was here. And the whole hallmark of apartheid was such that there were two types of education: the education of the white people and the education for the black Africans. The main difference was that African people were educated not to be professionals, but to be service providers. To be a skilled professional was reserved for a particular group. So what you see now, in terms of even the current education system, it is trying to bridge that gap. And by that, what you find is that most of the people who are in positions where you actually need to change these structures and influence science and research are actually mostly white male. If you look at that aspect now, the effect of role modeling, that you start to see that the white males are more likely to just take like. They recruit also white people as students. Particularly, I can tell you an example. When I joined the division where I am now, the class that I'm currently now teaching was 100% white students. When I came in, I said, no, we need to teach everybody, including white students. After 30 years of coordinating the class, it was 50% black. So because I was now there, black students started to feel that they can actually also do it because they could see me in higher positions of power. But it's not that easy. When I went into this system, in terms of just inequality, what I did find was that you are getting into a space where you are not invited. Sort of you are forcing yourself into a space. And what happens in that space is very interesting. It's not like blatant exclusion. It's subtle issues where nobody talks to you. You are given an office in the far corner. Sometimes people don't greet you. And when it's time to, let's say, even take students for supervision in the initial years, even the students themselves, no student will come to you until they start to see you producing good students. All this stemming from the issues where people could not believe that a Black African can be in such a position where they can get power. And the other example I can tell you is that I had a white student who for the first time was being taught by myself, an African. And when I corrected their scientific grammar, they did cry. They couldn't think that I could correct them. But you empathize when you are in these positions. And when you are in that space, you are holding it and saying, you want to change it for the best of everybody, not for the best of any one group. But what plays around is just the issues of inequality, because how many people are able now to access the education that can allow them to be in the position that I am? I was very lucky, I can tell you. That's why I'm always looking at how can I give an opportunity to any Black student to come and possibly show their potential. I was given bursaries when I started my advanced level. Up to university, I went for free. Zimbabwe had this free education system. I took advantage of that. And then I did most of my studies in Sweden at Karolinska Institute. So if I was not given that chance, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. This is what motivates me and say, maybe if I can give an opportunity to the next person, they can break through just like I did.
Ah, that's really powerful, Collet. And I think this podcast is mostly focusing on mentoring and paying it forward and giving back to the community where you've benefited. Also demonstrating how to do it. And I think this is something that a lot of our listeners are really interested in hearing more from you. I can see how you're, being conscious of some of these inequalities and disparities was a real motivator for you to address, starting from just the environment where you were in. And I believe you've since been going further beyond just your own department, your own institution. Are there any other activities that you've been involved in that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, Alice, it's like I said before, in South Africa, you find there are different levels of education, or what we call quintiles, where from quintile 1 to quintile 5, the lower it is, almost nothing is being taught there. Up to the highest quintile is where there's the best education. But also, the higher you go to the next quintile, the more expensive it becomes. So most of the Black people will be in quintile 1, quintile 2, because they cannot afford to pay the expensive education. So what I've done now is it's been running for the past 10 years. I'm very happy about the 2 programs that I've come up with. The first one is where I put together a group of professionals, academic professionals, professors and medical doctors coming from the 3 universities in the Western Cape, which is our province here, University of Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Western Cape University, and actually the Cape Peninsula University, the 4 universities. So what we have done, we are about 11 doctors and professors. We adopted a school in the township where we take our postgraduate students every other Saturday, and we go there to teach maths, science, and biology to the learners for free. So we have been doing this, and then we help them to apply to universities. So we do career guidance. Per month, we go there twice. So we've been doing this for 10 years, and we've started to see some of our products coming to university. Powerful, and some of the students are now in my class, and I really appreciate this initiative. The other initiative is that we thought, no, we cannot just wait for the students to come. We have developed what we call a job shadowing, where we allow grade 11 learners. Now, we don't discriminate. From all schools in the Western Cape, we've got a day in the year that we spend with them, the whole day, where they go through activities that are in the Faculty of Health Sciences, looking at biomedical sciences, forensic sciences, medicine and all that, so that they can start to think and shape their career. The grade 11s are just 1 year before the final year, which we call the matric, which then is the year that goes to university. This has been such a program that even our Vice Chancellor has now started to participate in this program, because it really motivates these learners, and they now know that these universities, which they thought are just for the rich, they can also come to these universities. I'm very passionate about that. And previously, access to our university was just for people who had their fathers and mothers working in the university. Those would be the ones who could come for job shadowing. But now we said, no, we have to do it in a considered manner where we advertise, we call all the schools, and we even pay for some of the schools who cannot access, who don't have transport to come, so that they come for the day. That's some of the initiatives we have.
Absolutely. And I think I can see the passion coming out of you. And, I can already feel inspired. And I think the model that you're using is certainly giving results. And we're looking forward to hearing more in the future how that is going.
The model where we have adopted this school in the poor areas, because I'm part of the World Academy of Science Young Affiliates, we have now asked the other countries to adopt it. So when we had a meeting in Rwanda and Rio, people are starting now to follow that model. When I presented, they're already now asking me how we do it, and I'm sending the material. So I'm very happy to know that people are actually taking care of the less privileged so that they can also access the same education.
That's wonderful. It shows how, when you are passionate about something and you believe in something, you should follow it up. In fact, it's a lesson that we got from one of the people we interviewed earlier on empowering the youth. And one of the things that they mentioned was that, follow your passion. And if you're passionate about that one thing, find out what it is and do something about it. And I think you are following that model very well. You mentioned your Vice Chancellor and, the support that she's been giving in your programs. I was actually reading an article yesterday from the UCT News, which talked about, Africa is a sweet spot to lead global collaborations. And I just want to step out of South Africa a little bit, because some of the text was talking about what if, for once, we decided that Africa was the center of the world. And this is, again, trying to build on this momentum about building capacity, strengthening capacity of African researchers, and bring them out into the world and having something to showcase to the world. This statement actually was made by one of the professors at UCT. And I was reflecting on this and think, for Africa to be the center of the world, Africans have to have something to show the world and to make people believe that Africa is indeed the center of the world. But first, of course, the Africans themselves have to believe this themselves and to be confident to showcase themselves. So what role do you think, as an academic and research leader, what role do you think you can play to build that confidence among African researchers so that they can truly believe in themselves first, so that they can showcase what they have, the talent they have, the resources that they can offer?
Thank you, Alice. First, I just want to premise this with, I train masters and PhD students, and I can just tell you that I've trained PhD students from across the continent. I've trained someone from Ethiopia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Ghana, South Africa, and Botswana. This is exactly what we are doing. We must do away with the 1894 boundaries that were put in Africa due to colonialism. Africa was not divided before the colonial boundaries. Africa is very rich in terms of human diversity. I'm a geneticist, and if you go back, if we think about global health, if we want to do drug discovery, to find the basis of disease, to find the biomarkers for drug response, Africa is the best place to go. So already we have got one very important aspect in the bag, that is its people. If we can utilize and develop areas where we can do very good clinical trials, we have got the best populations because they've got the diversity of the underlying genetics. But what needs to be done is to look at Africa as one, not as a divided continent, and train people, which is now the UCT becomes a central place because UCT is the leading university on the continent. Myself and my colleagues, we have been looking beyond South Africa to train. Once we have got the critical mass of researchers in Africa, it's only a matter of funding that we can actually leverage the full mighty contribution that Africa can give.
Yeah, that's very true. And so, of course, you touched earlier on having role models. And do you think there's a role model deficit in African research?
Precisely, Alice. Just before the H3 Africa, which has contributed quite a lot in terms of also trying to train some of our African researchers. Most of the research that was happening in Africa was what we call the helicopter research. People come in, just take samples, and then they analyze them from away. And then when the discoveries come, sometimes you don't even hear about an African name on those discoveries. So there is a deficit. I think we need I think one of the blights on our continent is corruption, that if we could harness all the money that we lose through corruption and put it through to research, we will have a lot of researchers. I think on the same effect, I want to thank even other international organizations, Wellcome Trust, NIH, that are funding us, while our governments are doing sometimes very little in that front. So yes, there is very little in terms of role modeling. We need to train many more people.
Yeah, we should take into consideration that obviously the young people are the future generation. And definitely they do need to have some role models to believe in. And just you mentioned earlier that when you joined your department, there weren't other people who looked like you. And now that people were starting to see you and to see Africans making it and doing good research, that other young people are also being inspired, and they're coming from all over other African countries as well. And that's really quite a good achievement. My last question is really around what you touched on, which is about empowering the youth. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier on, we had a discussion with the Global Citizen who are doing exactly that and are using a mentorship model, a specific mentorship model, which empowers young people where they're able to identify what they can achieve, what they have to offer, and what or whom do they need to get there. And this is obviously applying it in different industries and so forth. And I was wondering if you really are thinking about developing that critical mass of African researchers who can participate on world stage and contribute to, all this tackling of all these unresolved and ever-growing problems of disease. How do you see such a model working, for example, in global health and research?
In our part of the world, we don't have a choice between a mentor and a supervisor. You are both. What you do first is you have to trace on your own to say, what didn't you like when you were going up? And try to start to attack those issues that you thought were retrogressive in terms of your growth. One of the things that we have done recently, actually, I think a week ago, we registered an organization, the African Pharmacogenomics Consortium. The idea is that we need to create centers of excellence where people in different parts of Africa can go and do particular aspects so that we don't require every lab to have every skill because we don't have those people. But we will skill each particular center, let's say in East Africa, to be able to do, let's say, pharmacodynamics. Let's say in South Africa, we can say then you can do HPLC and LCMS's analysis. While we can say in West Africa, you can do the pharmacogenomic part of it. But having then an integrated way where you have got meetings and mentorship. It's one of the models that I've been looking at. Already we have started meeting online, discussing where people can throw out their questions and challenges so that we help each other. But the major factor that we face is funding. Most of these activities need funding, but we are not stopping because we don't have funding. We are using the little funding that we have to really start going, while it's at the same time looking for relevant calls so that we can apply. One of the things that I have put in the heads of my colleagues and young students is to say, nobody owns a student. There's a tendency of old professors thinking that they own the postdoc, they own the PhD student. We are there to actually facilitate the direction that a particular individual wants to go. Not to tell them what to do, but to support them when they come with an idea. That's my philosophy as we do all these activities.
That's really profound. I think the work and, the activities that you've been up to, you've obviously, mastered the art, and hope as you go along, you learn, and what doesn't work, you ditch it to the side and, you go with what works. So it's really been wonderful to talk to you, Collet. Do you have anything that you would like to share with our listeners? Just some final words?
Yes, I would just want to say one of the things that I've really been finding difficult in my career is what we call the benefit of doubt. It's very difficult to break into certain cycles, particularly if I can go into funding. If we are black, to be believed is in some instances you have to team up with someone who is white for your ideas, the same ideas. to be acceptable. So this has always been a problem. I hope one day people can just look at ideas and not look at the person behind the idea and fund those ideas. That would be a wonderful future, and we can then catalyze most of the ideas that we have. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Collet. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks to all our guests for coming on the show to discuss this topical but much needed conversation. We hope you found this episode and the discussions in it useful, from representation, advice on overcoming challenges, be it physical or operational, to bridging the gap by being resourceful. Don't go too far, because the discussion continues in part 2. As always, all the information on the guests, including where to find them, can be found in the description box. Please follow us on Twitter at mentor_podcast. That's at mentor_podcast, where we'll let you know when new episodes are released. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud by searching for Your Digital Mentor Podcast. You can send your inquiries, comments, and questions to inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. That's inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. As always, please remember to tell people about us. See you in the next segment.